I'm really excited to really focus in on storytelling. I've heard a couple of presenters talk about the power of stories and storytelling, and so we thought we'd build that into the program a bit. And we've got an American history historian and professor of history and American studies from Yale University, Joanne Freeman, and professor of history at the University of Virginia, Brian Ballow, and they're going to have an interactive session, interactive being the operative here, Leadership for Democracy. So please join me in welcoming Joanne and Brian to the stage.
Hello, welcome to the University of Virginia, and thanks for coming. It's great to look out at all of these bright, optimistic faces. What we're going to do today is talk about leadership styles and approaches to leadership over 3 or 4 centuries. My colleague Joanne and I are each going to focus on a couple of leaders across American history. But before we do that, Joanne is going to set the scene and give you a sense of what it was like in the very early days of Virginia, when it was really just getting started as a political entity. We're going to take a few minutes and travel pretty quickly through American history, and then we're going to interview 2 of your fellow, what do you call yourselves? GPSers?
Delegates.
Pathfinders. 2 of your fellow Pathfinders. We're going to talk to Toby and Collins for a few minutes, and then we're going to take your questions about leadership, and that's how we'll spend the next hour. So Joanne, take us to see. I think Joanne has the easy part because there were only 4 people in this period. I focus on the 20th century where there were millions, but there were only 7 people in the early republic. So take us back to those 3 who happened to live in Virginia.
Thanks, Brian. Great intro. I just want to really briefly set the scene and talk a little bit about one of the anniversaries that we're celebrating, which is the 400th anniversary of the creation of the first representative legislative body in the New World, which was here in Virginia. And I want to make 2 points about that. So on the one hand, I want to say that, that was a noteworthy and admirable thing. It built on the tradition of the Old World and on England. England wanted to establish a colony here in Virginia. That was, well, let me back up for a minute. That was admirable and yet not, because the point of it wasn't some great human venture, but it was an economic enterprise. So basically, England established this colony. They wanted to plant literally the flag of England in Virginia. They wanted potentially to look around and see if there was gold that they could get. So the primary purpose was not to establish that noble representative legislative body, but after they had been here for a time, they'd had some trouble, they restarted the colony, it seemed to be going okay, they then did import the British system of government and created that legislative body, which is admirable, fine, and that established a tradition in some ways that we're going to be really building on as we discuss what we're discussing here today. On the other hand, the people who were leading that colony were definitely not representative. So the people leading that colony would have been very wealthy, white men who would have been born pretty much to a high status family. That, for a long time in the colonies and then in early America as well, would have been assumed to be what it meant to be a leader. That was a small group of people, that's what it meant. We're going to be talking about people who do or don't necessarily fit into that category.
So let me ask you, in the early days, what kind of pushback, if any, was there against this very small cadre of leaders that really came from the same kinds of background?
Well, initially,
or did everybody buy into that?
Initially, not a lot of pushback. I mean, I think initially the assumption was that is the way things are. When you, if you jump ahead in time about a century and you look at the diaries and the letters of people who lived through the American Revolution, What's really striking is that before the American Revolution, they're not pushing back. So before the American Revolution, they just assumed that their British leaders were their British leaders, and they had a certain place in society. I remember a diary entry of someone who he was a shoemaker, and he talked about going into someone's house to make their shoes, going through the back door and being very nervous about the fact that the owner of the house wanted to address him in some way, and he felt intimidated. And after the revolution, that same person is confronting aristocratic seeming people on the street and telling them to get out of the way because they're in his way. So pushback is part of what develops, I think, over time. And the revolution is a moment when I think a lot of Americans learn what that felt like.
And that British thing, I learned actually in graduate school, even though I didn't specialize in your period, I learned that they were pushing back against the British because they felt the British weren't behaving like British should.
Right.
Can you
Right.
explain that to these people from all over the world? Because that seems kind of weird to me.
It does. Well, right, because you assume, right, if it's a revolution against something, that people are breaking away and reforming and trying to do something new. But in fact, the American Revolution was a lot of British colonists who didn't feel that they were being treated like British colonists. They felt that they were being deprived of the rights that they deserved as British subjects. So yeah, it wasn't that they were sort of declaring something for freedom. It was that they were demanding what they thought were their basic rights. And as that developed, it became a revolution.
So how do we get to this George Washington character?
This George Washington character. Okay, now I'm going to get really high tech here.
Oh boy.
This is scary. Okay, so this represents the people we're going to be talking about. George. Okay, so there's George. So we're like this, George and I. So George Washington, in some ways, is very much like the people I was just talking to you about, right? He's born relatively well off. His family is an important family. It's assumed he's going to be a leader of some kind. He's an ambitious person. He lives his life going through a series of very responsible leadership roles, right? He joins the Virginia militia and serves during wartime to get rank from serving in the military. He goes on to serve in the Virginia government. He ends up leading the Continental Army during the Revolution. He then presides over the Constitutional Convention, becomes the first president of the United States. There are many ways in which I could sit here and say, George Washington, what a leader. But the thing I want to focus on in speaking about him as a leader is none of those things. It's actually almost the opposite of those things. Because to me, one of the most outstanding things about Washington was that he was always in a position of power, but he was someone who was very aware of the need to limit power. So he was not a person, although he was ambitious personally, he was not a person who was trying to see how much power he could get. He was a person who was very aware of the fact that, in a sense, the most important aspect of holding power is to be willing to surrender it. And the most noteworthy time in which he did this was at the end of the American Revolution. Traditionally speaking, if you're a general and you're leading an army, and the army wins a war, you are then a person of great power, and those kinds of victorious generals go on to seize power in a variety of different ways, some of them pleasant, some of them not very pleasant at all. Washington basically just surrendered power and went home. This was not something that victorious generals did. And supposedly, the King of England, when he heard this, said something along the lines of, well, if he did that, he's going to be the greatest man in the world, right? He surrendered power. Who does that? Who gives up power? And because of that act, he became someone that Americans trusted with power again and again because he made it really clear he wasn't claiming it. He was surrendering it. And I just wanted to show you.
Joanne, why did he do that? Get inside his head, or tell us about the culture? Why did he behave so differently?
Well, I think like a number of people in that generation, they understood the fact that they were creating something new, and they felt some responsibility to posterity. And they understood that the things that they were doing would set precedents. And I think it's not that they were wonderfully virtuous. They weren't. I mean, Washington is a slaveholder, so there are all kinds of ways in which we can attack these people. But I think one thing that was admirable about them was they felt responsible. They felt that they were creating something experimental, that they wanted to be better than what had happened in the old world. And because of that, they thought very hard about the precedent-setting nature of what they were doing. And I think that's part of what was guiding Washington.
Yeah.
Was this is what should happen in a republic. This isn't a monarchy like Great Britain. This is a republic. A republic is a different kind of a thing. So I think that's part of what was guiding him. The thing I want to point out, this document that I have alongside his portrait up above, I love this document. I saw it for the first time a number of years ago, and it just represents to me everything that I just described to you about Washington as someone who was aware of the responsibility of holding power and of the need to limit it. That's actually a page from his copy of the Constitution, from when he was president, from the first term of his presidency. And I know it's hard to see, but on the right-hand side, you can kind of make out that there's pencil markings. So Washington has his copy of the Constitution. There's never been a president before, right? This is a world of kings and monarchs. He's basically given this job description, right? Here you go, George. Here's your Constitution. Your job is in there. And what he did was he very carefully went through and marked in the margin, president. Everywhere where his job was mentioned, so that he would understand, like, this is what he was supposed to do. And he wasn't supposed to do anything except for that. I just think that's such a powerful visual way of someone trying to figure out how much power he has and when he should stop. So I think that's a vital, and it's kind of counterintuitive, but a vital part of being a good leader is being willing to limit power.
So what about when it was time to run for re-election? He does run for re-election.
He does.
He wins. Presumably he could have run again.
He could have run, right. I mean, as long as George Washington stepped forward and said, I want to be president, he would have been elected.
So he served for 8 years now.
He served for 8 years, time for a third term, and he decided, okay, now it's time to me to leave and go home. Now, I will say that Washington is someone who spends his whole career going home, like, resigning things and saying, I'm done, I'm so done, and then gets yanked back in. But he does, after 2 terms, leave and go back to private life again, and that sets a precedent. There isn't, the Constitution doesn't, and this certainly not in this period, say that presidents only serve for 2 terms.
Right.
So Washington, by doing that, basically sets that
We
precedent.
didn't decide to do that until someone served for 4 terms.
Well, yeah, that's coming.
And,
That'll be coming shortly. But yeah, but so he just, by doing that, set the precedent, because who was going to step up and say, oh yeah, I'm better than Washington, so I deserve an extra term. So again, he, in setting that limit for himself, I think was setting limits of power for other people as well. So that's George, and the guy who surrenders or limits power would be leader number 1 that I wanted to point out.
So let me just be clear.
Yeah.
The takeaway lesson for these young people is they should surrender power. You guys agree with that? Is that a path to successful leadership?
Half of the message. Once you have power.
No, I think that's a really compelling message.
Once you have, yeah, if you have power, use it responsibly and be willing to give it up.
Perhaps a more positive way to state that is to think of the larger community, what you're building,
Why you have
the
the
larger whole. And certainly I study recent American politics and ask myself all the time, why don't people ever decide to do the right thing, even if it means giving up power? And so the positive lesson that I take away from this piece of history is thinking of the whole and being willing to surrender power, even when it's there for the taking, for the larger good of things. Is that A minus at least?
An A.
An A.
I'll give you an
wow.
A. I'll give you an A.
Okay.
Okay, so that was leader number 1 that I wanted to chat with you about. Leader number 2 is Ida B. Wells. Now we're jumping ahead in time, more than 100 years, so we're now going to be largely talking about the late 19th century, whereas Washington is the mid and late 18th century. Ida B. Wells, to me, is a really remarkable person. I got to know her a little bit through actually backstory. And through doing our podcast, we did an episode where she was on it, and I got to read a little bit about her. I knew of her before, but then I left.
She is not alive.
No.
Joanne makes history come alive. And sometimes you think we actually interviewed Ida B. Wells. We have a president who sometimes confuses dead people with live people. Ida B. Wells is not alive, and Joanne did not interview her.
I did not
want
interview
to be
her.
very clear.
I got to know her on paper.
Thank you, Joanne.
Thank you, Brian.
She gets very carried away.
I get very excited. So at any rate, I wanted to bring her to your attention because to me, she represents a leader who really bore witness to what was happening around her, to wrongs that were happening around her, and really aggressively, in a sense, spoke truth to power, stood up and said what needed to be said despite people really opposing her. She was born into slavery. She was born during the Civil War. She goes on to become a really leading activist and journalist for civil rights, for black rights, for women's rights, in any variety of ways. And constantly, she's doing that in the face of enormous opposition. So, for example, she goes on and establishes her own newspaper, right? There's a black press in this period and a white press in this period. She establishes her own newspaper. And in that newspaper, she begins to write stories about the practice of lynching. And this is mostly, I mean, it's, I suppose, happening everywhere, but it's largely in the South, the practice of publicly hanging and even torturing, usually black men, the claim being that these men were criminals and were being punished. So she begins to write about this practice, investigate this practice, really basically wants to find out what's really going on here.
Which is life-threatening.
Exactly.
To do this.
Exactly. So she writes for her newspaper about this practice, and ultimately her newspaper is burned down. Her office is burned down. She's driven out of town. So she moves further north and continues in this vein. She investigates, and she makes a point of saying she's looking at white newspapers. She's reading about things that white reporters say, and is pulling all of that data to draw conclusions about what was actually happening in the South. And of course, what she proves is that lynching has nothing to do with criminality. People weren't being lynched. These black men were not being lynched because they were criminals. They were being lynched because they provided economic, they were growing economically, and they were opposition, they were competition for the white community. And
an example would be an African-American business, basically what we would call a grocery store today, that was set
doing
up
business
and,
too well.
And doing too well, competing with the white competition, actually succeeding, doing better, and that led to a horrific lynching.
Right, exactly.
I think was a catalyst for her getting
Right,
involved.
it's someone that she knows actually is lynched in that case. And she really then goes out to investigate, compile data, and she writes this pamphlet, Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, in which she sets out, and she writes a second one after this, she sets out all her data. She says, look, here are the lynchings that have happened. Here are the reasons why they happened. Let's look at this practice. Let's talk about what this really means and what this really does. This was a radical thing for her to do. And she never backed away from that. She stood up, as I said, she spoke truth to power. She knew what was wrong. She stood up as a woman, which in and of itself was difficult, and then as a black woman, even more difficult. And so as a leader, the thing that she did in the face of enormous opposition, to me, that's worth noting, is being that person who was willing to push and investigate and get to the truth and then stand up and declare it, despite the fact that many people didn't want to hear it.
And one of the things that was so impressive about her is what that power was not what we would call fake news today. One of the strongest emerging powers in the press were papers like the New York Times, paper of record, papers that scholars today call objective newspapers. And they were objective. They weighed in, they said, this lynching is wrong. These African-American men who committed these crimes should be tried by a jury and go to jail. If they're convicted, they shouldn't be lynched. Well, what's missing in that picture? What was missing was what Ida B. Wells was documenting, which is that these men hadn't committed crimes in the first place. Yet objective newspapers, northern objective newspapers, simply took for granted that these African-American men had committed heinous crimes. And that's tough when you're fighting objective news in the name of objectivity.
Which is why she was so powerful. She compiled data. She compiled data from the very sources that were buying into that message. So she was a savvy leader, but a really persistent and aggressive leader in getting to the heart of something, seeing what it really meant, and then finding ways to communicate that to a broader audience, some to the north, and then ultimately actually to England as well. She took that message overseas to spread it, and then moved on to other forms of rights that she began to fight for. But she's remarkable just for her stick-to-itiveness and power and aggression with which she stood up and communicated that message at a time where it was so hard to do.
So your takeaway is first give up power, and now you're telling them to stick to it.
Or to speak to it aggressively if you need to.
No, I'm just teasing. I think persistence, we're going to talk about different styles and approaches to leadership. And all of you are leaders, and you know that a lot of this is deciding how to be in a particular historical context, in a particular situation. But I think what Joanne is underscoring through this is the power of persistence, even when you're marginalized, even when you're made fun of. And of course, Ida B. Wells faced threats on her life on a daily basis. And so I would imagine just being courageous is part of that formula.
On an ongoing basis.
Well.
Yeah, for sure. And now I'm going to turn the tables on you, Brian.
That's all the time we have for today.
Okay, Brian. So what do you got? What do you want to talk about?
Well, I want to start with a courageous woman of a very different sort than Ida B. Wells. Her name was Jane Addams, and she was born into moderate wealth in Cedarville, Illinois, a little town of about 10,000. Her father owned the local mill, and she grew up getting a good education. She went to a female seminary. She imbibed what at the time was called Christian socialism. She was very Christian, but she endorsed what today we might call a moderate form of socialism that was very popular in Great Britain at the time. And Jane Addams is best known for starting a settlement house, which was called Hull House in her case, which she started in 1889 in Chicago, in a very poor neighborhood that was surrounded by immigrants, Polish Jews, Italians, a good number of Germans. That settlement house started out with very, very moderate goals. What she wanted to do was simply read to the kids in the surrounding neighborhoods who were not learning how to read. She wanted to expose them to art. It was a very classic kind of do-gooding by a wealthy person who wanted to do good for others. What she did from that start was build Hull House into a model for basically all of the social services and the social safety net that eventually the government would provide in the 20th century. She went on to be a major peace activist during during World War I. She opposed very courageously World War I, and she was the first woman, American woman, to win the Nobel Peace Prize, which she was awarded in 1931.
But let me ask you, did she face a lot of opposition as a woman being in those kinds of positions or not?
Some of the opposition was so gross that now Chicago is a pretty rough place for politics, a lot of machine politics. You're supposed to clear things with the boss. And when she started getting more involved in providing social services, one of the aldermen suggested that, well, let's just say she should change her anatomy if she wanted to continue in this pursuit. I'm not going to be more graphic than that with this crowd. The point I want to make about Jane Addams is that at the heart of everything she did, and I think the lesson to be learned historically from her, is empathy. She was an empathetic leader. And I'm going to just read a short excerpt from her book, 20 Years at Hull House. And this is from her, the excerpt is from the first 6 months. She says, "That neglected and forlorn old age is daily brought to the attention of a settlement which undertakes to bear its share of the neighborhood burden imposed by poverty, was pathetically clear to us our first months of residence at Hull House. One day a boy of 10 led a tottering old lady into the house, saying that she had slept for 6 weeks in their kitchen on a bed made up next to the stove, that she had come when her son had died, although none of them had ever seen her before, because her son went there because he had once worked in the same shop with Pa. She thought of this guy, this family, to come ask for help. The little fellow concluded by saying that our house was so much bigger than theirs that he thought we would have more room for beds. That old woman herself said absolutely nothing, but looking on with that gripping fear of the poorhouse in her eyes. She was a living embodiment of that dread, which is so heartbreaking that the occupants of the county infirmary themselves seem scarcely less wretched than those who are making their last stand against it. What happened in the United States in the 1890s, if you were poor, if you couldn't afford a house, if you couldn't afford for it, you were sent to the poorhouse. And today we look at advertisements for, do you know what Applebee's is, right? Popular restaurants, Chili's. The ads all have people that are even older than me. Old people have money in the United States, and they have money because of things like Social Security. In the 1890s, when you got old and you stopped working, you became poor. And you went to the poorhouse if you didn't have family to take care of you. Jane Addams didn't set up Hull House in order to provide services to the elderly. What happened was she set up the settlement house to read to kids, to expose them to literature, and she herself was exposed to all of the elements that came from poverty, from immigration to a different country, from discrimination. And one by one, she fought to set up juvenile courts so that kids would be tried differently than adults. She set up services for the elderly. She created a kindergarten for kids, and she attracted a lot of women like herself to Hull House, who provided voluntarily these social services.
But what you're describing when you're talking about empathy is really a process of her learning
Exactly.
from the people she's engaging with.
Listening, paying attention, and being willing to grow and change. So it's not like when I say she was a Christian socialist, it's not like she had some ideological agenda she was going to impose on the neighborhood. It was almost exactly the opposite. She realized that these were good people who were really just lacking in some of the basic ingredients of her own environment, and she sought to bring that to their environment. And this leadership through empathy led her ultimately to the Nobel Peace Prize.
Okay, so
Time is marching on.
Time is marching on, but you have someone now very different to talk about.
Yes, Franklin D. Roosevelt. He's less different than you might think because he too came from a very privileged background, and he too ended up connecting with millions of Americans from a very different background himself. I'll spend less time on Franklin D. Roosevelt's biography. I think most of you have heard of him. He was elected president in the election of 1932. He's the guy who served for 4 terms as president. He didn't listen to Joanne when Joanne talked about giving up power. He died in office. If he hadn't, who knows? He might have been elected to a 5th term. Most people remember Franklin D. Roosevelt for the New Deal, for starting programs like Social Security that would have taken care of this woman that Jane Addams had to let sleep in Hull House. But what I want to emphasize in terms of Roosevelt's leadership is personally connecting with tens of millions of voters. And he did that by accessing a new technology, the radio. Now, the radio was not invented during Roosevelt's term, and in fact, Coolidge had given addresses. These are earlier presidents. Herbert Hoover, who presided over the Great Crash and the Great Depression that was raging when Roosevelt was elected, Hoover gave a lot of radio addresses, and he sounded like this, and he talked for about an hour and a half. And I'm going to go on talking like this for an hour and a half so that you can just see why people really did not connect to Herbert Hoover when he used this technology. So my point is a simple one, which is it's not the technology stupid, it's the way leaders access that technology. And Roosevelt, and I don't know whether he listened to this show or not, but during the 1930s, the most popular show on the radio was a show called Your Lover. And a guy with a much deeper voice than me would tell stories, and he'd say, snuggle up, get closer to the radio. I'm going to tell you a story. And he would go on like that. He talked in a soft, soothing voice. And millions of people, disproportionately women, felt like this was disproportionately, felt like this was their friend. Well, this is the technique that Roosevelt mastered in what you know as the fireside chats. He talked about mobilizing the nation to fight the Nazis, which the United States did not want to do in the late 1930s. Not by talking about policy or ideology. He mobilized the Lend-Lease program by talking about lending a garden hose to your neighbor, right? If your neighbor's house is burning down, are you not going to at least lend them? He didn't even say give them, by the way. That Congress would never have approved that. Are you not going to at least lend them a garden hose to help them out? And this intimate connection with millions of voters is something that leaders have sought to recreate again and again, some with very little success, some with great success. And they've used television to do that after Roosevelt. And today, they use Twitter to do that. And that sense of intimacy, that sense of real one-to-one bond. He's talking to me. Sorry. I'm not so good with technology. He's talking to me personally when he's talking to millions of people. Was really one of the most underappreciated elements of Roosevelt's leadership.
And of course,
style.
in a democratic mode of government.
Absolutely.
If you can touch the public that way, if you can make the public feel that they personally are being touched and pulled in, that's power.
And we can see this in an older form of communications, letters, right? Roosevelt received millions of letters from people. He had to hire dozens of people just to read through those letters. And if you read those letters, people are writing to him as though they know him. They're telling him personal stories. You can see it in the quality of the way people tried to communicate back to their president. So I think we better move along in our show a little bit. I'm getting the hurry up signal from our leaders.
Okay, so what we next want to do, and I'm going to introduce them first, is call up two people from among your number And as Brian was saying, you are all leaders, so we want to talk about leadership in a different kind of a way. But I want to introduce them briefly, and then we'll bring them up on stage. So Toby Ajayi is an author and an advocate for the rights of people who live with disabilities in Nigeria, and he has worked with a remarkable range of programs, many of them having to do with outreach. And that's, of course, some of what we've been talking about here in the realm of leadership. How do you reach people? How do you get people engaged in a cause? Colin Santanasamy is a doctor who is focused, his efforts are focused on providing medical care for the poorest people of Bangladesh, and among other things, founded a program called the M Exchange in Malaysia, which is about providing free medical care camps for thousands of people there as well. So these are both people who are certainly leaders, and will you both come up on the stage?
Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for joining us.
Okay, so we get to ask you guys questions now. We have one question we want to ask you, and we're very curious about the response. And the question is, if you could invent a leader for this moment to beam into your countries, what kind of a leader would you invent and why?
I can start. Toby goes first.
Okay.
See, he's giving up power. He was listening to this talk.
No, thank you so much for having me. So if I could invent a leader to beam into Nigeria right now, I would be inventing a leader with empathy. You know, I was listening to you when you were talking about Roosevelt and how he was able to connect with his people. So he probably, I mean, I read about him, and he didn't do everything right. I mean, he made mistakes, some big ones. But the fact that he was able to connect with the people, he actually served 4 terms and died in office. And like you said, if he had run the 5th time, probably not gotten elected again.
So how would he do that? How would one do that in Nigeria today?
Well, so how would you? So I don't know how we're going to get an empathetic leader in Nigeria today, but what would empathy look like in Nigeria today? We would have, and when I say leaders, I'm not just talking about the president or governors. I'm talking about everybody that's leading in whatever space, and it's about really taking the time to connect to those that you're leading. Because I always say this, people don't really care how much you know, and they don't even really care how much you have to offer if they don't know that you truly care. And the truth is, we might think, oh, a lot of us are civic leaders, so we're serving people who are poor and who are in need, but they know when they're being used. They may not, they may not feel like they have the right to complain about being used, but they know. And when you truly care, they also know. So the biggest thing that I've found is that people want to be sure that you really care about them, and it's not just about you. Because the truth is, we can do civic work from selfish places. And the truth is that people can tell if what you're doing is from a selfish place, or from a place where it's really about those that we're serving. And so for me, the way that we need to lead is that we should serve from a place of empathy, lead people in a way that it's about them and not really about you. Because the funny thing is that when you put the focus on the people that you're serving, somehow the focus comes back to you. Case in point, Roosevelt, 4 terms.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's very illuminating for me. Collins, what would you say?
I think for Malaysia, we are in a transition period right now. So we've just had like maybe 5 to 10 years of a very difficult leadership. And what we need right now in our country is basically ethical leadership as a foundation. We need leaders who are visionaries, who can look into the future, and also come with the skill set that is required to implement programs that are sustainable, to carry out these visions and to see these visions come to light. A lot of the communities in Malaysia that are from the rural areas and the minorities are not being represented in the way that they should be. And these are some of the issues that we really, really need to address in Malaysia now, since we just had our new election, a new government. And the government is trying really hard to do all this, but it takes time, and we are building from zero right now, to be honest.
Are you optimistic?
I am. I think that the younger generation in Malaysia is very aware about all of this. And with social media, with the internet, with the access to information, I think we have a lot of opportunity now that we did not have in the past. Yeah.
Well, terrific. We have a little less than 15 minutes left. And I think maybe we should just open it up to questions from the audience, but I want to give our special guests the first crack at a question. Please be sure to direct the difficult questions at Joanne.
All right. You want to go first?
Oh yeah, sure. So we learned a lot about different leadership styles. I just want to ask, as young leaders, because there's so many of us from so many different countries, how can we integrate all these sort of leadership styles into our own personal leadership? And how can we keep the balance moving forward in this different era? Because all of this was from a different age, and now we are in a different era.
Yep.
So yeah.
Well, I think your answer to the question that we asked is the beginning of an answer. And you just talked about younger people being aware of possibilities and the chance for change and opportunities. I mean, I think part of the answer to the question is being aware and willing to walk down that kind of path, knowing about in the past leaders who have been effective for reasons that we've been talking about here, for empathy, for outreach, but also being willing to implement change and be not just willing, but aware and eager to do that. I mean, here in the United States, I'm always really encouraged by my students because I feel that from them, right? If there are things happening here politically that I am less than thrilled about, I sort of feel like my students are the future leaders, and for the very reasons that you just said, they're going to understand what's happening, and hopefully, given people like Brian and I understand the past and things that have happened and worked in the past that represent good leadership, are going to be really willing and able to implement change.
Yeah, and I would just add that local knowledge, which both of you have in spades, I'm guessing, and which I have none of, is really a crucial base for deciding which combination and which sets of skills are most appropriate at any given time. Because I think we would both agree, we're historians, we always go back to the archives and the documents, and there is no theory, at least for me, that trumps, if you'll excuse the verb, an understanding of the specific historical context, the culture, and the set of social relations that you're trying to understand.
Where was this person? What was their world like? What is the experience of that person's life? And once I understand that, how can I understand that person and their activities?
And to go back to Toby's point, who are they connected with? Mm-hmm. Who are their communities? What are the interests beyond their own self-interest that they're serving?
All right. So I took a crack and looked at backstory.
Uh-oh.
I know.
And so I have this question. So from your experience as historians, do you think that leaders today learn from history? And do we have a lot to learn from history so that we don't repeat the same mistakes?
Okay, I will start, but.
Well, no, I'm pointing at you because here's my answer. I think leaders in the early republic took history much more seriously and valued it much more than any, if we're talking about presidents, than any president in the 20th century, and more than most leaders broadly defined in the 20th century. That's why I'm pointing at you.
Yeah, no,
because
and
I
it's
want
true.
I want
Something
history to
up.
win.
Okay.
And history doesn't win among recent
No,
leaders.
and that was going to be my short answer to part of your question is, are current leaders aware of history? And I would say, well, the short answer was really depends on the leader, and the answer in a lot of cases is no. And that is something that you can say for the earlier generation of Americans and people in leadership positions, is that they really aggressively looked to the past and tried to understand patterns of the past, not so that they could predict what was to come, but so that they understood interactions and pathways of power and how things were likely to happen and how that kind of knowledge might shape what they were doing. So I guess part
Go
of
ahead, Joanne, hit her with the cyclical notion of history. I mean, they believed, especially republics, were destined to repeat
themselves.
past history, right?
And yes, and collapse. So
And
part
collapse.
of what they were doing with that
That's
knowledge
where they
was, yeah,
were absolutely bound to end unless
they were
we
trying
really
to
understood.
fend off the
Right.
negative with that kind of knowledge of what had caused the collapses of the past. Right.
Great question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, it's your turn.
I know you guys are probably tired of hearing me, but good morning. My name is Jaquel. Well, afternoon. My name is Jaquel Goodwin. I am a student at Hampton
Technically
University.
morning. Good morning.
2 minutes.
Got a couple minutes left. I'm a student at Hampton University, and my question is: you guys talked about the willingness to limit power. This country has a great, I guess, saturation of wealth. Do you feel like that plays a great part in like limiting your power and looking towards the future and kind of understanding when to know how to disperse it?
So I'll promote an upcoming backstory show on reparations. In this case, specifically reparations for the families of formerly enslaved African Americans. And a lot of the show is actually about the wealth gap and how that was created. And there are many reasons for the wealth gap in the United States, but a lot of it, of course, goes back to slavery and then what happened to emancipated slaves when the 40 acres and a mule that they were promised by some never came to pass. And a lot of Americans today look at, 40, giving a government handout. Government was handing out stuff to white people throughout its entire history. It was handing out land. It was handing out support for agricultural equipment. It was handing out free college education for white service people, mainly men who served in World War II, but not for African Americans. So to get back to your question, I think one of the things that's really impeding the United States in terms of moving towards a more just and equitable society is not acknowledging the history of the ways in which this nation has empowered and literally handed out a lot of things to some citizens when it's taken away systematically things from other citizens. And I think until that's acknowledged, we're going to have a lot of trouble achieving a really just and equitable society.
Which gets back to what Toby was saying, right, is that you have to acknowledge the past. You have to understand the history of how we got to where we are
Right.
to be able to implement that kind of change.
Hi, whoops. Hi, my name is Finn. I'm a Virginia delegate. I keep hearing on the news that universities are cutting their history departments. And I guess I wanted to kind of hear y'all's perspectives on that. I'm sure as historians are not super happy about it, but I guess what are the broader implications? Because I think it's been...
You're the problem. We're not cutting history departments. You're not taking history. Your turn.
My turn. Well, I think, and it's not unconnected to the first question, right? I think in the current climate, there's a focus on pragmatic, and I want to even say economic success.
Yep.
And I think history and the humanities in general, for many people, it's harder to peg them into that hole, which is a very defined whole. So I think the elimination of history departments goes along with the elimination of a lot of other kinds of humanity courses, which seemingly don't have value because what do they accomplish? Now, of course, what they accomplish is exactly what we've been talking about here. You can't understand where you are in the present without understanding how you got here. And so, yeah, we have strong feelings about it. It's wrong. And kind of stunningly wrong-headed. I kind of can't believe we're at a point where that is happening anywhere. But it's self-defeating, self-destructive, and ultimately at cross purposes with everything that should be happening in education and with the country creating people to go on to succeed in ways that get beyond what we were just talking about, in ways that get beyond how much money can I make and keep and use, and to think more broadly about what the nation represents.
Good afternoon. My name is Patience. I'm from Nigeria. And my question is, as a student of history, you're told to interpret history objectively. And sometimes we kind of forget the fact that the figures in history were at some point subjective, and that's why we study them. And coming to my activism on radio, sometimes you hear comments as you're being too emotional, you're just reacting, and you hear sexist comments even from people who come to your show as a guest. So how do you kind of balance subjectivity and activism?
Well, so you're right. As historians, we need to be objective. We're also people studying people. And I think part of understanding history is understanding that human element. Now, part of what you're suggesting there, I think, is very true, right? So as women, particularly, you're accused of being over-emotional or paying too much attention to emotion. You know, a lot of the work that I happen to do as a historian is centered on understanding the emotions of the people who I study in the 18th century, in the 19th century, because once you understand how people are responding to things, you can understand why they act the way they act better. But you're right. It's really easy to dismiss that as not hard evidence, you know, as something that doesn't really teach you anything. Obviously, talking to me, I think that that's wrong-headed. I think it's partly sexist, so it is partly, you know, a way of eliminating a way of thinking about history. But I also think it's a way of pigeonholing history as being some very small thing that has to do with data collection and facts. And, you know, this gets back to the idea of history as a humanity. History is about the human condition, and the human component of that is enormously important. I just don't think you can understand the past or the present without understanding that what you're talking about is people, flawed people who make choices, some of them good, some of them really not good, for all kinds of reasons, some of them seemingly foreign to us. But understanding their subjectivity is part of understanding the past, and acknowledging that we do or don't feel connected with those people is also part of understanding that past.
Yeah, I just want to second what Joanne, I think she was way too emotional. No, I just want to second what Joanne said, and I'll just say that I think historians ourselves as a profession, as a history of history, are at fault because until quite recently, to take US history as an example, almost all historians were white males. Almost all historians worked on topics about white elite males. And it's only in the last 25 or 30 years that US historians have looked at the history of African Americans, the history of women, the history of environment, and looked at history in a much more transnational context.
Have allowed for the fact that women study. You know, the first thing I wrote was about the practice of dueling, right, in the 18th century, very male. And I know for a fact that people who didn't know who'd written that article assumed it must be a man. It's a male topic, it's writing about men.
And why was he named Joanne?
I know, what a strange name for a man. But again, it's the range of topics and the understanding that different kinds of people can focus on different kinds of things.
Last question.
Okay. Hi, I'm Genti from Albania. I'd like to touch a little upon the so-called global leadership in the area of Trump. It perfectly makes sense. He's voted from American people. He's thinking to fix things in-house, domestically. It seems, but to us, third parties, it seems that the throne is empty. I mean, U.S. is not anymore there, like being the guardian of, I mean, not taking care for other countries, but being the guardian of some standards, some democracy, some inspiration. I emphasize it totally makes sense for an administration to focus on its domestic issues, hoping maybe that later, after improving things in-house, they might come and feel the throne again. Do you see that possibly like other countries like China or Russia might seek to jump in that throne, or have little small shining stars on a regional level, like Turkey, for example, in its region, or France in its region? So how do you see this moment in this global leadership perspective?
Well, I think Trump's approach to governance and his philosophy, if you can call it that, has left an incredible vacuum in the existing world order. Now, as an historian, I'm well aware that world orders change from time to time. Many of us thought that it was changing at the end of the Cold War, when the Berlin Wall was torn down, and many of us thought that it was moving towards an acceptance of free trade, an acceptance of the essential nature of human rights. It now seems to be moving in a very different direction. And yes, there is a vacuum. One of those topics that American historians have spent much more time studying is American imperialism and colonialism. So a lot of what people would say, good riddance, America, in terms of defining the world order. I personally, my own political view, am very worried about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think the United States has dominated what has been the current international system. I think there have been some very good things about that and some bad things. I would love to see evolutionary change in what has created a certain degree of stability in the international order over the last 70 years, 75 years, not a precipitous withdrawal from it. Although, if you are paying attention to the newspaper, we may come out of this meeting and discover that Donald Trump has engaged quite precipitously in a war against Iran. So it's not a complete withdrawal.
Thank you. That was both informative and enjoyable. To Brian and Joanne, thank you.